I still can't decide if I regret going into that cabin or if I'm grateful to have walked away at all. My name is Liam, and this is the story of how my friends and I came face to face with a board game that didn't just predict our fates, it created them. When Rachel first suggested we check out the old Mahoney cabin, I was all for it. I've always been drawn to the thrill of poking around abandoned places, and the year 1972 felt like it was ripe for adventure. Emma, Dan, Rachel, and I piled into my rusty station wagon one late afternoon. We drove along winding back roads until we found the neglected path that led to the cabin. It stood in grim silence, the front porch warped with rot. Every window looked like a dark eye staring us down. Emma shivered beside me as we got out of the car. "Let's make this quick," I said, shining my flashlight into the cracked windows. We stepped up onto the rickety porch. It felt like a single misstep could send us crashing through the floor. Once inside, dust and stale air greeted us. Dim evening light slipped through broken panes, giving everything a haunted glow. We split up to explore, stepping cautiously over creaky boards and fallen beams. "Guys, you have to see this," Emma called out from a side room. I rushed over, curious. She knelt by a small wooden table littered with cobwebs. Dan stood behind her, arms crossed, looking skeptical. On the tabletop lay a battered box with faded symbols carved along its edges. Scratched into the wood was the title, A Game of Echoes. "Never heard of it," I said, running a thumb across the lettering. Rachel joined us, eyes wide with curiosity. "No one in town ever mentioned a board game like this," she murmured. We pried open the lid. Inside was a circular board with strange runic symbols. Small wooden tokens rested in a groove, each etched with odd markings, and an hourglass filled with dark gray sand. In one corner a tiny many-sided die glinted under the faint light. "Let's give it a try," Emma suggested cautiously. "What's the worst that could happen?" I joked, secretly regretting how ominous that sounded in a place like this. We dusted off a rickety dining table and placed the board in the center. The sky outside was darkening into twilight. We only had my flashlight and a small camping lantern for light. Emma volunteered to go first. She unrolled what looked like handwritten instructions on the edge of the board. "Move your token according to the die. Then speak your challenge aloud." "Challenge?" Dan repeated, raising an eyebrow. Emma shrugged and rolled the die. It landed on 3. She advanced her token 3 spaces. Then we heard it. A faint hum seemed to vibrate through the table. Suddenly, a distorted version of Emma's own voice echoed around us. "I will lose what I treasure most." My skin prickled. Emma reeled back from the board, eyes wide. "What was that?" Dan blurted out, jaw clenched. "A hidden speaker? Some kind of trick?" I wondered aloud, but the cabin was dark and empty. I saw no sign of anything that could produce a recorded voice. Emma looked shaken, but tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just a gimmick someone rigged years ago," she said, though her tone was unconvincing. We agreed to keep going, but Emma set the die down and glanced at the Polaroid camera slung around her neck. It was one of those new, pricey models she'd saved up for. Her pride and joy. She clicked it open, planning to snap a picture of the board for a keepsake. But when she tried to snap the shutter, it jammed. No, Emma muttered, fiddling with the lens. "It was working fine earlier." She pulled out the film cartridge, shaking it gently. The inside looked mangled, film ruined. "This can't be happening," she murmured in frustration. Her face fell as she realized her cherished camera might be broken for good. "It's the one thing I really treasure." Her eyes met mine, and we both realized it aligned a little too perfectly with what the echo had just foretold. A new tension hung in the dusty air. Dan let out a shaky breath. "Enough playing around," he said, stepping up to the board. "If this is just a trick, let's prove it." He grabbed the die before any of us could stop him and rolled. It landed on 4. Dan moved his token. That same low hum filled the air, and Dan's own voice echoed, "Blood will mark my path tonight." My grip tightened on the lantern's handle. Dan cursed and yanked his hand back from the board. A thin cut ran across his finger, and blood droplets spattered the dusty floor. "You've got to be kidding me," he growled, pressing his palm against the wound to stop the bleeding. No one spoke for a moment. We just stared at one another, realizing how accurately these challenges were playing out. "We should leave," Rachel whispered, voice trembling. "Now." We hurried across the cabin, kicking up clouds of dust, trying to keep Dan's blood from dripping everywhere. The front door was still open, or so we thought, until it slammed shut on its own. I froze, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What was that?" Emma hissed, her camera bouncing uselessly at her side. Dan tugged the door open again, and we stumbled onto the front porch. A cold night breeze hit us, full of tension. I led the way off the porch, stepping across the overgrown yard. Then, through the quiet air, we heard it. A strange, hollow laugh echoing from inside the cabin. "That sounds like Rachel," Emma whispered, her face going pale. Rachel stood right next to us, her eyes wide with fear, yet we all heard her voice coming from inside. "It's mocking me," Rachel said, her lips quivering. "I haven't even taken a turn yet." Deep down, we knew we had to face the board again. We had an unspoken sense that something wouldn't let us leave until the game's demands were met. Back inside, the place felt darker than before, even with the lantern. The board sat on the table, tokens arranged as if waiting for us. I clutched Emma's arm as Rachel approached the board. "Don't do it," Emma pleaded, but Rachel's expression hardened. "We can't just run," Rachel said softly. "It won't let us." She took the die, closed her eyes, and rolled. It landed on 6. The hourglass flickered, casting ghostly light on our faces. A moment later, Rachel's own voice reverberated through the cabin. "I welcome the shadows into my heart." All at once the lantern flickered violently. Darkness from every corner of the room seemed to move, coiling around Rachel like living smoke. She let out a muffled cry as we lost sight of her in that swirling blackness. Then, just as quickly, the shadows recoiled back into the corners. Rachel collapsed onto the floor. "Rachel!" I yelled, rushing forward. "I'm cold," she whispered, her eyes half open, strangely distant. Dan and I lifted her, supporting her weight. Emma hovered beside us on the verge of tears. When I glanced at the board, I felt a spike of terror. It was now floating an inch above the table, tokens sliding across its surface on their own, though no visible force moved them. "We have to get her out of here," I hissed, heart pounding. We didn't look back until we reached the door, half carrying Rachel and half dragging Dan, who was still bleeding from his cut. The night air engulfed us again as we stumbled outside. I yanked open the station wagon door, and we piled in, Rachel across the back seat, Emma next to her, and Dan beside me, trying to stanch the blood seeping through his makeshift bandage. As I turned the key in the ignition, I cast one last look at the cabin. The front door stood wide open now, letting us see into the gloom. I swear I saw the board drifting mid-air, tokens still clicking in some unreadable pattern. And over the roar of the engine, I heard all of our voices, my own, Emma's, Dan's, Rachel's, mingled in eerie laughter that set my hair on end. I floored the gas pedal, and we tore down the gravel road, careening through the darkness. It felt like only blind panic got us back to civilization. Rachel came to a short while later, shivering like she'd been plunged in ice water. She wouldn't talk about what she saw when the shadows closed in. Dan's hand healed, but he still has a scar that runs across his knuckle, an eternal reminder of that night. Emma's Polaroid never worked again. She found the camera gears were warped beyond repair. She told me it felt like she'd lost a piece of herself along with it. I haven't slept well since. Some nights, I wake up thinking I hear the faint rattle of dice against wood or the rustle of tokens moving. I wonder what would have happened if we'd rolled again. Would the game have let us leave or trapped us forever? Part of me wants to believe we got lucky, that we broke free before a game of echoes could claim more from us. Another part fears we may have just postponed whatever it has in store, like some dark force is still watching, still waiting. I'm telling you this in hopes nobody else will ever go near that cursed cabin or pick up that accursed board. Sometimes, the scariest thing about a prophecy isn't the knowledge of the future. It's realizing that prophecy can force you to fulfill it. If you ever see a battered box labeled A Game of Echoes from 1920, 1930, or whenever it was crafted, walk away. No matter the temptation, no matter the curiosity, don't let it whisper your fate.